Today, I'm joined by Dr. Laura Nanni, who is an affiliate researcher at the UCD Centre for Ethics in Public Life. She is the author of The Porosity of Self, Husserl's Philosophy of Self and Personhood, and also collaborates with clinical psychologists in Chile using her Porous self model as an alternative framework for understanding the self in psychopathology. Her research includes maternity care, focused on lived experiences of childbirth in the biomedical model. She teaches philosophy for children, P4C, which I say everybody should get a chance to do, and contributes to peace and conflict resolution initiatives through the Thinking Changes project funded by the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs in conjunction with Queen's University Belfast. We also have Conor Gavin back. Conor is a person with lived experience of psychosis and now works in the field as a psychosis research coordinator. He holds a master's in clinical neuroscience and blends his lived educational and professional experience in all he does. Conor is also the founder and director of the Psychosis Arts Collective, which we discussed in our previous episode, an organization which empowers creatives with psychosis, raises awareness, and fights stigma. Conor is at the intersection of evidence based clinical services, the recovery based approach, mental health policy, and the lived experience movement, hoping to bridge the gaps and ultimately improve outcomes for everybody. So, the question, tell me about yourself. It sounds simple, but what are we actually asking? Are we asking about memory, personality, your profession, your trauma, your beliefs, your brain chemistry, your relationships? Or are we asking something more fundamental about the structure of experience itself? Philosophers have wrestled with this kind of question for centuries. David Hume said that when he looked inside, he found no self, only a bundle of perceptions. Immanuel Kant argued that the I think must accompany all experience. The self is what unifies consciousness, according to Kant. Sigmund Freud fractured the self into the id, the ego, and the superego, suggesting we are not even masters of ourselves. And Friedrich Nietzsche described the self as a battlefield of drives, and that unity is just a useful story. The doer is a fiction applied to the deed, according to Nietzsche. Contemporary neuroscience often tells us that the self is a brain generated model. But then there's Edmund Husserl. Husserl doesn't begin with metaphysics or brain scans, he begins with lived experience. What is it like to be a self? Not as a theory, but as something lived. And in Laura Nanni's reconstruction of Husserl, the self is not sealed, isolated, or purely internal. It is porous. Porous meaning the boundary between self and world is permeable. Between self and other is permeable. Between past and present is permeable. Between habit and freedom is permeable. The self is embodied, temporal, it's sedimented history, it's relational, and is always intertwined with others. And that raises profound questions. If the self is porous, what happens when the porosity intensifies, when boundaries loosen, when meaning floods in, when self and world blur? Is that pathology? Is it revelation? Or is it both? Before we begin, there's one important distinction. When psychology or neuroscience speaks of the self, it often refers to mechanisms and brain processes, memory integration, cognitive models. When psychiatry speaks of the self, it may refer to disturbances, hallucinations, delusions, and boundary dysregulation. But philosophy asks something different. What must be true for experience to be possible at all? What is the structure of being a subject? What does it mean to be a person, existentially, not just biologically? Those are different levels of analysis, and if we collapse them, things can get confusing. So today we're asking things like, what is the self? How stable is it? How embodied is it? What does it mean to be embodied? How social is it? And maybe what happens if that fractures or opens too wide? So we'll start with a question for Conor. Conor, any of the descriptions of self or the things we mentioned there, do they ring true for you or hit any do any of them recognizable to you?
Yeah, I suppose, look, no more than anything in philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, it's kind of a little bit of everything. There's not one statement, or I think a lot of people, like certainty. Um, but I think when you study anything, when you study any kind of discipline, be it psychology, neuroscience, philosophy, anything that you've just kind of raised here today, Dahi, you have to be comfortable with being uncertain about things. And there comes a certain amount of humility in that as well. I think, people think that scientists know it all or researchers know it all and that they're certain about things and you can test everything. But especially in mental health, like it's hard to measure things. How do you measure if someone is doing well or not doing well? There are ways of doing it, but sometimes lived experience can offer a lot, and that brings its own uncertainties and certainties. But look, I'm open to ideas today and see what comes up. But yeah, being
Good.
comfortable in the unknown, I think, is important.
That's good. So yeah, in mental health, you can't always get a ruler out or a measuring tape. It's not that kind of material, you know.
Exactly. Yeah.
Laura, when you describe the self as porous, which is your project, uh, what are you correcting in kind of traditional models of personhood?
Oh, that's a great question. And also, Dahi, you've done a beautiful job of kind of summing up the core thesis of the book. So I really appreciate that. It
No
was it
problem.
was really lovely to hear someone else say it. Yeah, so effectively, this idea of porosity or openness, fundamental openness, and presupposition to change, right? Is kind of is the core theory of what porosity means. Now, effectively, my thesis, this porous self thesis, is responding particularly to several dominant theories of the self in philosophy that tend to overly emphasize one dimension of the self and downplay or almost omit the other side, right? And what does that mean? Effectively, if you think about, and I don't want to get too heavy here or too theoretical, right? I'm going to keep it as light and as straightforward as I can. But oftentimes, when people hear the word self, right, they think of this kind of, oh, it must be this like really deep core inner part of me, that's almost you can nearly not verbalize it, it's so completely intrinsic, right? This very kind of sense. And there is a theory by an incredible phenomenologist called Dan Zahavi. Zahavi is one of the top Husserlian scholars. Now, Zahavi came up with this concept called the minimal self theory, right? And effectively, again, Zahavi, remember, is a phenomenologist. And keep in mind, phenomenology is a method, it's a toolbox, right? It's looking at structures of an embodied lived experience, okay? And it gives sort of a whole other perspective to how we can think about things, how we think about the way we experience things, including ourselves. And so Zahavi comes up with this kind of a structure, right? This idea that the self, the very core, really intimate part of the self, is equated to this sense of mineness, what it is like for me-ness experience. Because, of course, first and foremost, we are all subjects of experience, right? We all experience ourselves in relation to others and the world around us from an absolutely, extremely individual, subjective, unique perspective. Dahi, I can never be in your body and inside your mind. You can never be in mine. Conor, same story, right? Because fundamentally we are embodied beings. And so the body, Husserl often calls us the 0 point of orientation. All right. And so effectively, this kind of heightened understanding of subjectivity, Zahavi kind of takes and really puts a massive microscope over it, right? And what he's trying to do with this theory is really bring to the fore the absolute subjectivity of lived experience. Okay. Now, in doing so, while the concept itself, it's great in terms of, yay, subjectivity and highlighting that absolute individuality and uniqueness, the problem is that Zahavi's theory is basically saying that that experience of mindness, or what it is like for meanness, can be experienced in complete isolation, completely independent from, and without any reference to others or our surrounding social, cultural, familial environment, right? Again, he's saying that that minimal experience of mindness can be experienced in total separate isolation, independent from and preceding any referential experiences to others or the world around us.
What
Okay?
does he base that on? I mean, I'm just thinking myself, and this seems to be kind of um, the pre-linguistic kind of self
Yeah.
that he's pointing to here.
Yeah.
Um, so would this mean that's the self that is available to animals who don't have language?
That's a fabulous question, and one that I am not going to touch. I'll tell you why. Because again, we're into territory. It's a beautiful question, and I love that. Like, that is a whole wonderful field of inquest that,
Hmm.
there are some amazing thinkers working on. However, when it comes to sort of these phenomenological ideas, it's all about embodied lived experience, and it's human. It's a decidedly human kind of methodological framework that we're discussing, right? And now, massive questions come into play when we talk about the concept of empathy, which is a huge part of, the actual the structural constitution of the experience of the self, right? Now, empathy, I'm not getting into it, lads, because it's an enormous area, right? And I want to try and keep it as simple as possible. But empathy, in the phenomenological sense, is not quite what we understand it in our day-to-day sense, because again, we're talking about a structure of experience, right? And it's a structure of how we experience the other in our kind of conscious awareness. Okay. Now, I just, you know, put a pin in that for a minute, because I know I need to go back to that. But effectively, the concept of empathy and empathic relations with animals, in particular in the animal world, that's a whole other field of incredible exploration. But it does touch on kind of metaphysical concepts and existential inquiries in terms of existence and the existence of other minds and that kind of stuff. And that does sort of step outside the realm of phenomenological investigations, because
Hmm.
again, phenomenology is all about understanding how we live through and experience ourselves in relation to others and the world around us. And it is about understanding how we have this sense of the meaning, how things are meaningful to us, how we experience ourselves as meaningful, how we experience the world around us as meaningful.
Well,
But this doesn't, oh, sorry,
does that,
fire ahead.
when you say that about like the minimal self, is there meaning there in the minimal self, or
Brilliant.
is that something that precedes meaning? Because to me, meaning comes with the linguistic world. I kind of
Okay.
Lacan, when you enter that
Mm-hmm.
symbolic world,
Mm-hmm.
that's where meaning lies. So I wonder, is there meaning in that minimal self that you're talking about, or is it just a sense of I'm here?
Listen, that is fabulous question, because that is actually one of the massive issues with the minimal self. In Zahavi's writings about the minimal self, he uses certain, sections of work of Husserl. Now, again, I don't want to sound like a stuffy academic and use big words that, by the way, it's only a language. It's not something anybody else would find difficult to understand. It's just a language that we use to talk about these things. But effectively, Husserl does at times in his work talk about this concept of the ego. Now, this is not related at all to Freud, so we have to make that very clear. But he uses this kind of terminology, and he talks about the ego sometimes in this sort of isolated sense, right? Now, what Zahavi does is, now again, I'm trying to keep this as simple. It's kind of, it's quite techie, our tech version of techie language, right? But effectively, in these sort of descriptions of this ego that Husserl has, they are in fact an abstraction. They're always an abstraction from the social human being, the social person and the social world and others. That is always already the starting off point for Husserl in any of his investigations. And that's where a lot of people who have the kind of old reading of Husserl miss the point on that, which is what my work is trying to bring to the fore. And so what Zahavi does with his theory to sort of back it up, right, is he takes these sort of excerpts where Husserl has this very, kind of detailed description of the ego in its isolated solipsistic sphere of ownness, and, these kind of, fancy words that, really what Husserl in his descriptions is doing, it's actually showing how, in fact, you cannot have any sense, meaning, understanding, or knowledge without implicit reference to the other or the world around us, right? But what Zahavi does is he takes these kind of sections and he says, well, actually, here's a description of this ego that's stripped of reference to the others and our social environment around us. And that's what the mineness, or the what it is like for meness, is. And that's what can be separated off and analysed and understood and so on, right? Now, problem with that is enormous. And I'll tell you why. In psychopathological, oh my gosh, Conor, how am I saying it? Psychopathology.
Psychopathology.
Yeah, okay. In research on mental health, let's keep it simple. This theory, because obviously, and Conor, you again are the professional in this, so back me up if I make any silly errors. In such kind of disorders as schizophrenia, for example, it is generally understood as a disorder of a disturbed self-experience. It's conceptually, depicted as this very kind of profound inner disturbance of the self. Right now, the model of the minimal self is what has been used in psychiatry for the last 20 or so years as representing conceptually, theoretically, this self that is being disturbed. The what it is like for meness is being disturbed. So again, lads, I'm a lowly phenomenologist, not a psychiatrist. I must make that very clear, but I am working with psychiatrists. So again, I'm just making generalized sort of, citizen examples, not from any clinical standpoint. I have to make that very clear. So effectively, the problem is that this understanding of the self being this, this conceptual idea that's really minimal, it's narrow, it's one-dimensional, and also would fit very nicely into a scientific kind of equation. Do you get me? Because it is so, it's so bare, right? And so the reason why my colleagues have explained to me this was sort of favored in the beginning, right? As this is a great thing that we can use, is because A, it's simple, it's straightforward, and it brings forth the importance and significant role of the subject, of the subjective experience of the disturbances, right? Now, the big problem with that is it entirely omits the fact that A, we are fundamentally embodied human beings, and B, we are inextricably embedded in our surrounding social, cultural, historical, and familial environment. And that, in actual fact, when you consider how we experience anything, ourselves, others, or the world around us, and I keep that just to keep a very simple structure in terms of speaking, you cannot separate one from the other. even if you go to the most isolated mountain, Mount Everest, on your own, there is still implicit reference to others and the surrounding world that cannot be separated, right?
Yeah, that's really good. Let me just see, have I got you so
Yeah,
far?
no,
So
sorry, I know I'm getting a bit.
no, no,
Please
no, no,
pull
no.
me
It's
in if
fine.
I'm
No, no,
getting a
no,
bit
no. Let's.
off.
I think I'm following, and I think the listeners will follow too. But
Yeah,
let's see if we can um, explicate what you're saying. So Zahavi's minimal self
yeah.
is kind of useful because it cuts off all the messy stuff, all the complexities that we have to
Mm,
deal with that are involved in being a real person, in
correct.
that where we're from, who we are, who we talk
Yes,
to, and it becomes useful scientifically as kind of a data point. And but
correct.
what you're saying is that is not really a true representation of the self. The self is always embedded in society. The self,
Correct.
just being a person, and I'd argue even just thinking in language is kind of
It's all
it's
intersubjective.
it's a social
Correct.
activity. Um, so it reminds me of Newton and gravity.
Oh, go
Zahavi's
on.
thing. Well. When Newton first thought up of gravity, he never actually found out what it was. I don't think we still know what it is, but we know what it does. And
Go on.
he said, like, you know what? We know what it does. That's all we need to know. You can forget about the rest.
Oh
So
my God,
that's
he's a phenomenologist. I love him. I didn't
well,
know that. That's fab.
yeah, but it's just he knows what it does, so we can work with them calculations. So to me, that sounds like the kind of minimal self. We don't need to know what a person is. We just need to get a data point
Correct.
we can work with.
You've nailed it.
Um,
That's it.
but
And again, and I mean, don't get me wrong. And like, God forbid if any loyalist Sahavians get wind of my argument, I'll be, lambasted.
Mr. Sahavi,
But
you're welcome to come on and
oh
defend
Jesus,
this.
stop. No, Tommy, stop. No, because look, genuinely, it has been a huge movement. There are some incredible, psychiatrists, phenomenological psychiatrists, who have used this theory, and it's been of huge benefit to a point. But here's the problem with it, and the problem is why the psychiatrists reached out to me in the first place, and it's this: how then, when you think about disturbed self experience, right? Now, Conor, again, I'm only talking from my perspective. Please don't judge my very minimal, pardon the pun, knowledge of mental health disorders. Okay. But this is from my perspective, what they have told me. When you think about the genesis of self disturbed experience, right? When you think about, obviously, how it kind of comes on and it builds up over time, it sort of doesn't just happen overnight, right? As in, something is sort of accumulating, and in other words, then this is my perspective again, right? And effectively, there is a genesis then when the disturbances start, of how far they go and what shape they take, and so on and so forth. In other words, it's a dynamic concept, this concept of self disturbance. It's not static, it's not fixed, and it's certainly not isolated or alienated from the experience is alienating. I mean, like, physically, you're not taken away again on a mountain on your own having this experience, right? You're always in a social environment. You're always in a context of some description, right? Now, the guys, and effectively then the guys are talking about, then when you talk about the narrative self, Dahi, I've heard you speak about the narrative self, mention it a few times, which is great. And I'm going to come to that. But effectively, the guys are saying, look, if the self is this core, isolated, fixed entity, how do you explain the correlation between this closed, fixed, impenetrable concept, or this experience, and then the more social narrative forms of the self, right? In other words, in our wording, you'd say the constitutive correlation between the two cannot be explained if that's a theory you're working with, right? So effectively, when you think about then what I have done with my theory is I have combed through Husserl's work for years and found that, you know, he has the most incredible, rich, multi-dimensional picture and descriptions of self and personhood throughout all of his life's work, not just, early, middle, and late Husserl, which again, to read him chronologically is actually the worst thing you can do because he's a zigzagger of a thinker. He's mad. Like his writings are, anyway, we won't go there. But in other words, there is this massive multidimensionality to the way that he explains the embodied lived experience of a self, of ourselves, right? Paints a picture that is absolutely applicable and understandable and reliable to every person alive. Because when you think about it, the embodiment, for example, first of all, it means that we express who we are through our bodies, right? Our bodies are our way of being in the world. We perceive with our bodies. Perception, mind you, is the five senses, don't forget. It's not just visual, right? We're embodied beings, right? And for Husserl, consciousness is embodied from the ground up. Therefore, kind of critically responding to any dualistic conceptions of consciousness, right? Which is what, say, from Descartes, your Hume, moving up to then the kind of the philosophy of mind crew, and that end of things are always sort of taking this dualistic split approach to understanding sort of neurological brain function, very cognitive capabilities, and sort of, separating it off from effectively the embodied and the social and the embedded experiential side of being a self, right? And so effectively, the embodied part is absolutely key. And it's also pre-reflexive because we are embodied from the ground up from dot, right? And by pre-reflexive, I mean not cognitive, right? Not active, like high cognitive acts of, recognizing concepts and this kind of thing, right? Pre-reflexive means embodied. It means affective, right? So here's a little example of an
Hang on
affective.
now. I'm going to stop you there.
Am I going
you're
off
grand.
topic?
You're grand. You're grand. I just want to give.
Sorry.
I just want to hear what Conor has to say on what you've already said.
Please do.
So Conor, when you hear the term like the porous self and embodied as how Laura is talking about it, does it resonate with your lived experience and your professional experience, or do you see something that it's missing?
Yeah, and look, obviously, the philosophical language and some of the terminology may be a little bit lost on me, but I am getting the bigger picture here, and there might be some marrying of the two in terms of neuroscience and the brain, of which I'm also not really a true expert on. Like I have some background in neuroscience, but I wouldn't be as well versed in it as some people. But there is the idea, we have our emotional brain, our limbic system, the old brain or the animal brain. I thought it was really interesting, Dahi, how you asked, does this apply to animals? Really interesting question. And obviously animals do have, cognition as well as, certain animals would have the frontal lobes and that kind of thing. And in humans, in Homo sapiens, obviously our frontal lobes are much more developed. So that's why we can think and so clearly. And, we have our executive functioning and reasoning and logic and everything like that. But I wonder, in this idea of the self, like where does the limbic system fit in? Where do just our knee-jerk reactions, our emotions, it's so automatic. We don't think about how we feel as clearly as, so like doing an equation or doing maths or thinking about philosophy, the logical side of philosophy. And to add on to that, then I suppose a big thing in mental health these days is mental health across the life course. So obviously we have CAMS, we have child and adolescent mental health. I was in CAMS. We have youth mental health. We have psychiatry of later life. But what about parenting, and what about like babies, like children, like young children? Where does the self, so you're talking about social, you're talking about, interactions with the world. I find that really interesting from, an emotional, cognitive point of view. When you talk about someone that doesn't, as you said, like pre-linguistic, like like babies don't have not yet learned English or any language, So how does it fit in across the life course? And can the self change? Like one thing we know about measurement is that, if you really want to measure something in mental health to see how outcomes are improving, if someone is responding to medication and intervention, recovery, um, how do things change and how stable or transient are these kind of things? So across the life course, what is changing there in terms of your understanding of the self, and how does this all fit into that kind of thing? I know I've probably hit on a number of different things, but I think it's interesting to try correlate some sort of scientific brain biology into this conversation. And maybe Dai,
No,
you have some thoughts, or Laura.
no, yeah, I think that's
I
that's very interesting stuff there. I mentioned Lacan a while ago. I don't know that I explained what I was bringing up. Lacan talks about how babies enter the symbolic world in that kind of moment or that period where they're being shown themselves in a mirror and they're being pointed to
mhm.
by the parent and given a name, like, that's you, Susan, and this is dad or mom. And that separation is actually what almost builds the self for Lacan. You know what I mean? And not builds the self, I guess, brings the person into the symbolic world, I think he calls it. And that's where selves belong for Lacan. You know what I mean? In that symbolic linguistic world. So I think it's an interesting question too. Do babies have selves? That's kind of what you're asking, Connor, is it? Is there a
Yeah,
self there
somewhat. And
in
how does that
babies?
evolve? Like, how does that evolve into an adult? How do we, we do know there is obviously developmental psychology, there's developmental ways of looking at mental health, and, how things develop in terms of even psychosis or any kind of disorder or condition. So how, what age do you think, maybe Laura, are we coming close to a sense of self? And maybe it's different for everyone. Obviously our brains, our frontal lobe develops fully probably on average with age 25 or something like that. So how does it look across children, teenage years, adulthood? Does it change?
You can take that one, Laura.
Okay. I'm so excited to get into this with you because without me needing to bring it up, you have brought up effectively the essence of this whole theory. And the first thing I'm going to say to you is the word habit. I'm going to say habitual bodily memory. And that if you were to put a definition on what the self is, what the poor self is, it is effectively the unique, abiding, habitual, embodied style of life. Now, sir, I'm going to answer all your questions, right? Well, excuse me. I'm going to give my subjective opinion on your and my research on your questions. So, okay, do you remember I was talking about the self other world? I kept saying that self other world. That's how we experience always, all the time. Self other world are implied in this. It's the very structure of our experience because we are embodied and embedded, and we are always implicitly referred to others around us and the environment around us, okay? Because we are fundamentally social beings. So self other world is this structure, right? How are we in the world? Well, we're habitual beings, right? And habituality is, in fact, a pre reflexive, pre linguistic, affective form of self experience, okay? And that all begins in the womb, all right?
I just want to clarify
Yeah.
that when you say effective, what do
Oh,
you
sorry.
mean for the listeners? It's,
Okay.
it's to do with emotion, is it?
Okay. So, first of all, it's like a primordial layer of emotion, if that makes sense. A primal layer of emotion. So emotion is huge, right, in all of this, absolutely. But let me explain. When I say affective, I'll give you a quick example, right? Okay. An affect is a very individual dimension of lived experience, because it's a very subjective, individual, embodied lived experience. But it's the content, it is informed by this sort of social culture, by the environment that you're in. Now, here we go. Okay. Let's say the three of us are sitting here now and we hear a bang, a huge bang, right? Let's say, I've grown up in a war-torn country. Let's say, Conor, you have grown up in, the woods of Wicklow Mountains. And Dahi, you've grown up in, Dubai. You've lived by a building site your whole life,
Ooh,
right?
lovely.
Bear with me. Each and every one of us will have a very individual and unique response to that loud bang. Okay? And it's an embodied response, not cognitive. It's an affective, embodied response. So, for example, I've grown up in a war-torn country. And if I hear a loud bang, for me, historically, loud bangs mean serious trouble, means trouble's coming. It means someone's after being injured, something's happened. And so my response could be a very visceral, kind of frightened, oh my God, kind of a response, right? Now, Conor, you've grown up in quite a sort of, peaceful, environment with very little, urban sounds or, no conflict or so on and so forth. Your reaction could be kind of also quite kind of astonished and so on. But it could be more sort of it wouldn't be as sort of filled with fear and terror, say, for example, as my reaction would be, right? Because perhaps for you, a loud bang could mean a tree falling or something. Do you know what I'm trying to say, right? And then Dahi, we come to you. Perhaps you have absolutely no response because you are so used to loud bangs and noises and knocks and this, that, and the other that you don't even flinch and you keep going on with your call, right? What does this mean? This is effectively to do with how all of our lived experiences, every single experience that we have had since dot, basically forms a temporally sedimented piece of experience, just bear with me, that sort of seeps into our embodied, into our habitual bodies, we call it, and it will build up over time to form a habitual embodied way of being, of responding, of engaging, of interacting, right? Now, what is required for a habit to be constituted in the Husserlian, in this sense, right? Because habits are not cognitive. There's no involvement here of a cognitive mental act happening. This idea of the habitual bodily memory is absolutely pre-reflexive. It's embedded. It's, I don't like to say subconscious because that's not phenomenology. That's, more kind of psychology and, that kind of end of things. But when we say pre-reflective, we mean sort of before you come to be fully cognitively aware of something. Do you get me? It's like, that sort of way that we take for granted when we move through the world. Like I'm chatting away now and I'm also picking up my bottle. I'm not even thinking about it, right? That kind of spur of the moment acts that we don't even need to think twice. We just do, right? So that's sort of what the habitual bodily memory facilitates. It facilitates our seamless moving through the world, that we can, walk from A to B while being on the phone, because we don't have to think about how we move our feet and how we move our steps, because we have our own habitual way of walking, of moving, of engaging with the world. Okay. Now, I'm sorry guys, because it is a bit tech, but I'm going to try and condense this as much as I can. So part of this structure of how the habitual bodily memory builds up over time and effectively, is our way of expressing our uniqueness and individuality in our shared common surrounding environment. You can't have one without the other, by the way, right? Is that a part of it is this concept called affect and attention, right? And it's this idea that effectually, I'm sure you've heard of this whole thing about perception and perceiving objects and that kind of I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's a phenomenology thing. It's a psychology thing. It's this idea of perceiving objects and the object of my perception and all this, right? I try not to use that wording too much because it can be lumped in with this sort of positivists and the Humeans and stuff like that. But effectively, it's kind of to do with the way that we perceive and this concept called intentionality. Have any of you come across this concept before?
Yeah,
Conor?
intentionality. That would be the kind of the root of the pre-linguistic self for Husserl and guys like
Absolutely,
that,
yeah.
wouldn't it
So
be? It's just that initial instinct in the world to be towards something.
you good man. And that's literally all it means. It's actually quite simple. All it means is that we are our embodied consciousness, and I have to keep repeating that because consciousness, when you think of it on its own, you think of something floating up here in the in your mind. No, it's embodied. It's the whole way. They're both, you can't separate. Our embodied consciousness is always reaching out towards something other to itself, right? We're always already paying attention towards something other to ourself, right?
How does that hit you, Conor, hearing that? How did, like, when you hear that embodied consciousness and intentionality from that, how does that strike you with your experience and with your work and with your academic work?
Intentionality. So just give me a brief synopsis of
It
Okay.
well,
it means directedness.
just so I can answer a bit more.
Do you want to take it, Dahi, or me? I don't mind.
yeah, it's directedness.
You take it,
It's a pre-linguistic kind of intentionality towards the world. It's just our intent towards things. You know what I mean? Our leaning, our being for something or being towards something in the world. But the embodiedness as well is in. I'd be interested to hear your take on the embodiedness part of consciousness, where mostly we think of it as just in the head. And being neuroscience, I imagine that's kind of the area that they think of that in. So this embodied feature of consciousness, where it's actually your entire body, and that body is in the world. Does that ring any bells with you?
Yeah, so I suppose like intentionality, I suppose moving towards something, is that like, I suppose gotta give an example of like having a goal in life.
Can I jump in here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just because, okay, Conor, this is it in a nutshell. Bear with me. I'm going to try and keep it as simple as possible, right? Okay.
I just want to answer. Just can I just maybe go?
I'm giving you a quick one.
Yeah.
You know, with delusional thoughts, right?
Okay.
People who have delusional thoughts, and people will say, "Well, that's not real. That's not real. It doesn't exist, right? What you're talking about, it's not real. It's delusional." Okay. However, the lived experience of that for the subject is very real. Okay. That's because they are being directed towards something other to themselves, that's outside themselves. If I think now of a pink unicorn, right? I'm thinking about it. I'm kind of can see it. I can, I'm having this, lived experience of imagining this pink unicorn, right? Whether it's real or not doesn't matter because I'm being intentionally directed towards this imaginary thing. The existential reality, the ontological reality, that doesn't matter. It's that you're always being directed towards something other to yourself. So even if you're thinking about yourself, right? Even if you're trying, mindfulness, and you're trying to have this, deep inner thought of yourself, your consciousness kind of always has to reach out and kind of, gosh, this is very difficult now because I've got myself into a hole. Can I stop and just see if you've got me at all so far?
Yeah, we'll just let Conor come back at that and see what he thinks of that and see if he can.
Yeah, well, I suppose talking from someone who has schizoaffective disorder, who lives with schizoaffective disorder, it's interesting, these topics, because obviously I started with having delusions. Like my first contact or first interaction with any real the mental health sphere was slipping into a psychosis, which was the loss of touch reality.
Wow.
So then those periods then where I recovered, I was young, I went back to school, I went to college and had a depressive episode, so low motivation, everything like that. and then following that, for different reasons, a manic episode. So there's been a progression here, and I suppose I'm not saying that in the delusional world it feels so real, like as in you said, Laura, like it's
Absolutely.
real for you. So
And it is
um
real for you. Do you know what I mean?
mm,
You're having an absolute, unique, individual, subjective, embodied, lived experience of this thing.
mm.
You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah,
And
yeah.
whether it doesn't matter the existential status or the social status of the thing, whether it's real or not, it's real for you, and that's what's important.
Yeah, it's very immersive as well. But what I would argue as well is that, for me at least, depressive symptoms, which still everyone encounters depressive symptoms at some point, and maybe a little bit of mania as well. Maybe not everyone is manic all the time, but like you do kind of balance between low mood, high mood, even the
Absolutely.
basic high mood. Like everyone, typical people have this as well. But that I find that actually can be more difficult. Like I'm talking more clinical, more mental health sphere here.
Yeah, yeah.
Is that when I have a low motivation or low self esteem or low perspective in a depressive episode, that's very all encompassing as well. You know what I mean? So
Absolutely.
we do talk about delusions. Obviously, we talk about psychosis and losing touch with reality. But something that I'm grappling with, at the moment, and I'm not asking to pathologize me or give me personalized recommendations, but talk about it from a philosophy point of view. Like, how does the mood element? Because as I mentioned, schizoaffective
Mm,
disorder is a psychotic disorder with a mood component, and then the mania, you feel very encompassed in that as well, and it's very visceral and real and immersive. So you know, it is interesting to talk about delusions, but delusions are only one part of psychotic illnesses. There's the
okay.
negative side of things as well. There's negative symptoms, which are apathy, blunted affective emotions, asociality, like lack of social interaction or social withdrawal. Um, there's all a whole host of different symptoms. So across all them, how does this apply to these kind of dimensions of mental illness? I suppose
Oh,
is
brilliant
is
question.
and I suppose what I'm trying to say really is there potential applications of this? Because
Mm,
I'm a researcher in a sense, but I'm also a lived experience researcher. So
yeah,
I'm working on a couple of papers, I'm working on a book, I've worked on other projects, and
yeah.
have been integrated into research teams as a co-researcher or a peer researcher and these kind of things.
Mm,
And when you talk about the scientific method, so being able to observe, hypothesize, observe, test,
mm,
conclude, and I'm probably rambling a little bit here, but how seen as lived experience is such a part of research these days, and mental health research, especially health research, even. You know, is there a way that your kind of grasp of philosophy, the self, could that be applied to, maybe clinically, but also how do I communicate my lived experience into a project, into so we have in the scientific method, you come up with the idea for the research,
mm,
you hypothesize something, you collect some data, you analyze that data. And really what we want to see in lived experience research, and there's policies being written about this, even at the
absolutely.
WHO level, that we should be involved as people with lived experience at each stage. So I suppose the two questions in this: what's the clinical kind of relevance of these
Uh-huh.
philosophical ideas, and maybe in research, is there a way to understand how lived experience and the experience of the self could mesh with the scientific method in terms of elucidating patterns and collecting data and analyzing data and concluding, interpreting data. So it's two separate questions: the clinical and the more academic side of things. Would you see what comes
Brilliant.
up?
Brilliant, brilliant. Well, first of all, like, you're absolutely spot on. I mean, it's all fine and well to sit here and pontificate, but what the hell does it all mean when we're trying to talk about how can you help people? What use is any of this, right? And one of the kind of most incredible things that actually came from putting the PhD and the book and everything was back in July when I was contacted by this clinical psychiatrist from Chile, from Santiago. And he effectively contacted me because there is a movement in psychiatry, slow and steady, of psychiatric researchers, psychiatrist researchers. What am I saying? People who are psychiatrists and very into research. Okay. And so effectively, what they want to really advocate for more and more, and I think I've heard you mention this before, of course, is person-centered care, right? It's a huge thing. It's also what I write about quite a bit in my work on maternal care research, okay? Person-centered care in heavily medicalized systems and so on. And how do we go about that? And like you said, how do you incorporate, translate a qualitative kind of study and analysis into something that is tangible and is quantitative and can be applied in a clinical setting? Now, we have this hypothesis, right? So it's myself and there's three other psychiatrists that I'm working with. And it's effectively that we have these sort of conceptual resources with this porosity of the self theory to look at the self, to look effectively at how, we experience ourselves, how that is constituted or made from all these different angles, right? Now, by the way, the biological, of course, it's a part. Sure, it's functionally inseparable from our lived experience, right? But it's not it's only one small piece of the puzzle. Do you get me? Right? So we have, of course, looking at embodied, embedded, habitual, social, all these other dimensions of the way we experience ourselves, right? Is kind of like it's a framework, okay? Now, keeping in mind, Conor, it's a supplementary framework to the biological neuroscientific research, okay? That's what phenomenology does, is it brings this whole other perspective that can hopefully deepen our understanding and then perhaps show, how we can think through the possibilities of change, right? It's not a method, here you go into your office now and, no, it's about actually helping us to come up with an alternative framework that can be measured, quantified, and in fact, my professor, I call him my professor. He's not he's my colleague, but I call him the profe. Was saying to me, actually, because I was telling him a little bit about yourself and the work that you do. And he said, and I wrote down what he said because I have to write everything down, lads. I forget my head. So he was saying, effectively, he said, we are thinking that we have these sort of conceptual resources to describe what happens when, in sort of altered embodied states, delusional states, schizophrenic, psychosis, that kind of thing. We have these other conceptual ideas to investigate the genesis of these experiences, right? And effectively, what we're researching is how these qualitative insights and this phenomenological kind of framework can be beneficial, utilized, and translated into quantitative and technological and neurobiological language, let's put it that way. For example, he mentioned a machine, and you can tell me this, Conor, an EEG.
Yeah,
What's that?
BEG, yeah.
Yeah,
So
the
it's the, you've
EEG.
probably seen it, it's the cap,
Yeah. So he was saying that, for example, and remember I talked about this idea of sedimentation, temporal sedimentation of the habitual body. There's an entire, and I won't bore you, I'm so sorry again for the tech speak, but there's an entire very detailed structure that we can spell out, and all these little different dimensions and things that actually give you a framework for understanding how, do you remember you were talking about like how the genesis of this self, and do babies have a self, and what happens and changing and all that? Well, this is actually a phenomenological structure that can actually explain that, believe it or not. It can explain how that comes to be, how we change over time, how we're always changing and dynamic, but yet how do we have this sense of sameness and difference at the same time, And
So
also it can, sorry.
You're right. The phrase you used there, say it again, the sedimented historical.
Oh Jesus, I'm so sorry.
No, it's great.
It's temporal. It's the sedimented habitual bodily memory.
Okay, yeah. So what that is like experiences we have in our life almost leave a mark or a residue,
They do.
which leaves
Perfect.
us, which
Yes.
sediments like the sediment at the bottom of a river,
Perfect.
and become a part of what we are. That's
And the key, what porosity brings to that, you're brilliant, Dahi, you're spot on, is porosity shows how these sedimentations are not fixed, how they are porous and permeable and open and predisposed to change, right?
Is given what we're talking about there now, the porous self, is it analogous to a river? In that we can give a name to a
Beautiful.
river. We can give a name to a river, but the river is always changing.
You
And the
got
water
it.
is never the same in it.
You got it.
But we still have that same name. It still has that same place. So
You got it. That's perfect.
The Corrib has been there forever, as far as I know. But it's never at one moment been the same. So can we think of a human life like that and a human self like that?
100%. In fact, Husserl always talks about the continuous temporal flow of consciousness. The continuous temporal flow of embodied lived experience. It's this idea that everything is ebbing and flowing and dynamic, and intertwined, and that's what the porosity is. You've got it. It's opening these ideas. It's opening all of these dimensions to show how they all interrelate with each other, and also how they can change all the time over time. But
does that strike you as true, Conor, what we're saying there, when we're relating the self to a river? And does that settle any notion of the porous self that we're talking about?
Yeah, that things evolve over time. Yeah, that definitely resonates. Like I could wake up in the morning and feel totally different than in the evening. It depends on how my day went. But I just wanted to bring it back. Maybe this is early days in terms of your research, Laura. But the EEG, I'm curious, where does this fit in the EEG machine?
So he was saying, basically, he was like, effectively, so what we're looking at is how can we correlate this kind of understanding of the self to then the quantitative technology that we have, where we can see, and he said, I wrote it down again, so we can see like dynamics and functioning and how it can inform the biological research and the mechanistic research that's being done, to give a broader picture again. And so, like, if you see different, like, let's say we talk about, looking at the structure of experience, and how I say, instead of being a disturbance of the self, it's a disturbance in the structure of how we experience of self, other world, right? And trying not to separate, because again, the big issue is that everyone's always trying to separate everything, put everything in a box. And no, nothing, you can't, right? Because it's all totally interrelated and intricate and messy, and you know what I mean? And so it's literally, we're trying to basically come up with an entire sort of reimagining of this framework of the self used in psychiatry, right? And the correlative sort of biological scientific measurements, for want of a better word, right? And effectively use this new idea of the self and come up with new biological scientific kind of correlations to effectively paint a much broader, bigger, richer picture of what's going on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Yeah, you're trying to maybe put some numbers on what you're saying, and maybe the next question that I kind of ask, or the next idea that I have.
Sorry, guys, it got dark there again. Good old Irish weather. Yeah, sorry about
that. It's a question of how much funding have you got? No, I won't ask that.
Here, listen,
because I've been in studies. I've been co-researcher, but I've also been a subject of studies. I've been a participant in.
Have you?
MRI. I've been in an MRI machine like too many times, probably. They're very loud, and it's really interesting.
That's
you can
so
do
cool.
You can do pretty much pretty sophisticated tests. There are limits to what we can tell. From functional MRI. So fMRI it's a live picture of what's going on. So it's I think that it uses blood flow basically to certain parts of the brain. It's not a perfect measure. It's kind of a proxy measure.
I think they're temporally and spatially a lot of space around them that isn't there.
Yeah. So temporally, quite good, and in terms of spatially, the fMRI is obviously, because you can
Sorry, I have a
see
visitor.
here. Okay.
Sorry, Conor. Athena! Lads, I'm so sorry. Please cut that
No
out. No,
worries.
it's my
Go
daughter.
on, Connor.
And she knows damn well I'm trying to do this.
And
She's a
yeah, no
oh,
worries, no
sorry for
worries.
cutting you off, Conor. Please continue.
I'll come back to maybe EEG in a minute and
Yeah.
maybe chat about that. And I'm not an expert on these things, by the way. I know from being in these tests as well. Probably more than the actual science of it all. But yeah, so that would be interesting. fMRI. I'm not saying
And like
they're
temporality is
expensive.
one of the ways we're constituted, for God's sake. We're
Mm.
temporal beings, and
Yeah,
that's a
yeah,
huge part, and how there would be a lot of correlation between sort of the temporal element of neurological, developments or unfoldings or whatever. Please forgive my lack of
yeah.
words
You have
for
to
it,
be
but you get what I'm trying
careful.
to
Yeah, you have to
say.
be careful
Yeah,
in terms of the inference of inferring, conclusions from fMRI studies. There is criticism of them.
yeah,
And like I remember, I'd watch a cartoon in there. It'd be like theory of mind kind of things. So how do we think about other people, what's going on in someone else's head? Which is also very interesting in terms, if you want to talk about the self, you you've mentioned the other a couple of times, and how do we
oh
think about
yeah,
other people? How does it influence how do we think about ourselves? But there'd be a question, would be like, someone puts a ball under like a box or something like that,
yeah,
and then another person comes along and changes it, and the first person comes back, and it's like, the question is, what does John think, where does John think the ball has moved? And it's like, you're trying to infer what other people are doing, and that kind of thing. And there's all different tests and then you can see what's going on in the brain. And obviously, if you take, I was part of a sample of 300-400 people in a study, whatever like that. It's quite good sample size, and it was compared to controls. And there's
yeah.
differences. There's differences in the brain when you look at um, MRI data, fMRI data, compared to. I know we talked about this, Dahi, before. There's structural, there's chemical, there are differences, genetic differences
Yeah.
between people with psychotic disorders or any mental health disorder and neurotypical controls.
And
And just
are they clear differences, Connor, or do they have to be inferred over many
it's large sample sizes.
large
You
sample
get the,
sizes?
yeah, and like even then, the data varies a lot, so
Mm.
and you can correlate that with cognition, then you can correlate it with a whole host of different things like demographics,
Mm.
male, female. You could put a whole load of covariates in there and see what the changes are.
And
Diagnosis,
That's where
different types of
phenomenology could
diagnosis. Yeah.
help with. Sorry to cut across you,
yeah,
but like you see the way you're saying there, like about then cross-referencing it with like characteristics or different groups or whatever, and that's kind of where again like this sort of whole other perspective and whole other way of thinking about sort of analyzing, understanding, and so on is just hugely beneficial, because as well as that, like not only can it just bring this in incredibly other extensive broader perspective, and again it's science is amazing, like geez, ps I mean with my own mental health struggles, I cannot believe I made it to 40 without medication, and that's the truth, honest to God, lads. Like I've just a whole new appreciation for everything that people who work in mental health do, you know but again it's like I've heard you say it yourself, Conor, like when in your last interview with Dahi, when you were talking about, say, well, when Dahi was asking some really interesting questions about the role of medication in recovery and so on. And you said, well, look at, yes, of course, it's the part that you can go in and it can immediately sort of relieve the sort of, critical psychotic episode or what have you. But medication is only one small part of the puzzle. I mean, for goodness sake, you can't just give someone tablets and off you go back to, say, your broken home or your whatever the circumstances that are supposed like triggering or fueling this sort of response. Please again forgive my ignorance. I'm just saying kind of from my
Mm.
from my very small understanding. There has to be more. There has to be a holistic approach. But again, a big problem, and you know this better than anyone, Conor, in your work, is there's just the systemic issues are just so enormous. The money, the lack of funding, the lack of interest in actually, giving holistic, creative, person-centered, taking each person as an individual and giving the proper respect and that they deserve for the experiences they're going
Yeah,
through,
there's obviously, there's a bit of hope as well. I know what you're saying, that
Yeah.
medication and isolation and people, seeing medical teams and being sent away with a box of pills. And we do see like that does happen.
Yeah.
But there is a movement, there is a huge boost in terms of policy and policy
That's
trickling down
amazing.
into clinical care. Obviously, there's the recovery oriented approach, which is hugely important. So you obviously, there's personal recovery, there's psychological, social, occupational, functional.
Yeah.
There's the chime model, which is used in recovery education a lot. So
Oh, what's that
reco-
called?
recovery education it's a pedagogical approach to, so it's educational, but it's not psychoeducation per se. It's co-produced in terms of, so I used to work in recovery education. Every time we would roll out a workshop on, we'll say, psychosis, for example, you
Yeah.
would co-produce that workshop with, so it's obviously with people with psychosis, but it's obviously based on evidence-based care as well. So we would have pulled from evidence and the literature, and we put a pull from lived experience and make workshops. But that
That's
was all based
fabulous.
on Chime, and the workshops are all evaluated
Chime.
through Chime. So what it is it's
What's
from
chime?
research done in the UK. Basically, Mary Leamy and Mike Slade, I think, are the kind of pioneers in this. It's connection, hope, identity, meaning, and empowerment. So
Oh,
these are the kind of the personal recovery kind of, as you said, holistic, more recovery oriented approach to mental health. And it's not widespread. It is kind of trickling into to there are studies done on it in terms of personal recovery, and there are follow-up studies, and interviewing people and doing qualitative analysis based on Chime, and the ideas do trickle through. um but yeah, no, there is
Mm.
hope. Like, there is work being done in Ireland, across the world. There's the definition of recovery. Like, how do you know someone is recovered? How do you know someone is in stable recovery? Well, there's different
Exactly.
ways. So there's
Exactly.
clinical, in terms of remission from psychosis, maybe it's no positive symptoms for 2 years or something. There's different
Yeah.
ways. 3 years. Is a hospitalization for psychosis considered a relapse? What is a relapse? What is
Yeah.
so different studies, and there's methodological variance here as well. Like, so if you do a
Of
study
course.
in some part of the world and they use, what we talked about, MRI, we talked about cognition, and recovery. Like, there's a lot of variance in terms of how we measure these things. But what's really important is, as you said, Laura, that things should change and are changing, I suppose.
Absolutely. Yeah.
There's hope
Mm.
coming down the line in terms of how we approach these things. And look, Ireland are quite good. In terms of mental health research, actually, and especially in psychosis, as I mentioned before we came on, that I'm going to SEER, which is one of the biggest schizophrenia psychosis kind of mental health conferences in the world.
It's
Ireland really
amazing.
punches above its weight in terms of mental health research. You go
Really?
if you ever go there, and I've been to some of these conferences. There's a huge amount of Irish people. So we are part of WHO consortiums in Europe, and we have huge amounts of grants from your EU Horizons, that kind of stuff. So we're doing quite well. Like, there's a lot of pessimism, I think,
Yeah.
in mental health. And look, I'm not negating the experiences that people have. People have horrific experiences with
Yeah.
mental health, and there are service gaps. There's a lot of gaps. There's theoretical gaps. There's evidence gaps. There's a lot of gaps, but a lot of them are service gaps. Like, the funding
Yeah.
is quite low.
Oh.
So
Mm.
I'm not ignoring that. I'm just saying there is hope.
Mm.
And
But
obviously
like that's why we
our
do what we
budget is
do.
quite
Yeah.
low for mental health.
Mm.
There's
Yeah.
great work being done in terms of increasing that. Like, the government have increased it from, what was it, 800 or 900 million to 1 point something billion in a couple of years, but still not enough, because the
But
overall health budget, it increases every year. Every year,
yeah.
the health services, require more and more for different reasons, and they seem to always, exceed that as well, which is telling as well. But the mental health budget is a percentage of that. I think it's could be 6-7%. I think it needs to be more. And I'm not ignoring the fact that there are issues. I'm just saying that, you know, when you talk about holistic approaches to care, there is things coming down the line, and I've been a
Yeah.
part of some of them approaches. So yeah.
I just want to kind of bounce onto something else a little bit here that I think is very relevant to a lot of what you just said and might help us explain the porous self that we're talking about, and it might drag out some of the things that we need to work on as well. And this is there are parts of society and there are people in society who seem to be more susceptible to psychosis, and I think people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds tend to be more susceptible to psychosis, and immigrants to new countries tend to be more susceptible to psychosis. This speaks to the kind of the social aspect, the porous self aspect of this, in that if you're from if you don't have any money, you're living in a rough neighborhood, you've been brought up in a rough neighborhood, your life is a lot harder. You're under a lot more stress. You know, you feel a lot less safe all the time. So much like that paper we all read, perhaps there's a reconstruction that happens when people feel in danger of the narratives inside their own head to recreate the world as a safer imaginary than what is. And you could see that happening for immigrants as well. You know, I mean, if you're living in some place that and you move to another place where things are vastly different, you know, where there's a different social setup, people speak differently, the little social norms that go on are different. You're suddenly, yourself is destabilized. It doesn't feel as comfortable as it did in your past country, even if it was war torn or even if it was harsh. There was a stability because you knew what was happening around you. You knew what to expect, and when you move to a new country, all that is up in the air. So immigrants are more likely to have psychotic episodes. You can correct this language, Conor, if I'm using it wrong as well.
No, that's a good point. Yeah, and I think we talked about a little bit about this, you know, on our
Yeah,
last podcast,
yeah,
in terms of the environment
yeah,
versus you know, the heritable side
yeah.
of schizophrenia.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but I think that it really matches up with the porous self idea. You know what I
Totally.
mean?
100%. Yeah.
That it's not just an individual genetic psychological thing where you can take somebody and say, oh yeah, you're a bit broken, we're gonna twist a few dials
Yeah.
here and you'll be grand.
Yeah.
You know, that there's a much larger thing going on, and that the self and that the person is always involved in the world. You know what I mean? And so in a sense, when we're talking about funding mental health care and how do we approach mental health, is is it not a larger problem than
yeah,
funding centers for mental health? Is it not
Yeah.
yeah.
something that we all need to consider, how we're treating people, how we see people, how we help integrate people into new environments?
Can I
How,
come in on this
please do,
real quick,
please do.
Tahi? So yeah, like, you know, obviously we don't exist in isolation by any means. So, you know, we live in a country, I would say Ireland. You know, we think about our health system as being very reactive. Like, people have symptoms, you go, and I'm not an expert on this either, but you know, even from a consumer of mental health care or personal lived experience, like, it's not until you get unwell or you have symptoms that, you know, usually this is when you have your contact with your doctor. The health systems that we would like to see is that it's preventative, it's early intervention, especially in
Exactly.
psychosis. And actually, to give an example, so in psychosis, there's been studies done in Ireland actually, where the motto is earlier the better. So the earlier you intervene in terms of psychosis, the better outcomes long term you have. So that it's called DUP, the duration of untreated psychosis. Excuse me.
DUP.
And that's huge. It's been a huge basis, for services in terms of early intervention and funding for these kind of services. And that's actually been found to be stable up until the 20-year point. And that's probably one of the longest studies that's been done. So the earlier the better. And that's actually true for 20 years later, if that makes sense. So that's one example of how important prevention, early intervention is. So we have a reactive mental health system and a health system in general. The way we think about health, even with diet, nutrition, these kind of things. It's why isn't there more focus on that? And then Dahi, you talk about the social factors, socioeconomic factors. Um, Someone that's living on a very basic income, um, refugees, immigrants, that kind of thing. These are hugely important factors, and we kind of think about everything in isolation, and there's a
Yeah,
lot of discourse around you know diet and fitness and stuff, but there's also a huge link between physical health and mental health as well. So there's so much going on, and I think as a health system across the world, it needs to be almost like a flipping upside down or a revolution in
yeah,
terms of even things like funding. We've talked about funding a lot here today. It's very reactive.
Mm.
The multi-annual funding for programs is very important so that we can see the benefit over time. So a clinician who's the lead for a service might have a couple of million to run their service for a year or whatever. But then the end of the year comes and they're like, well, what happens
yeah.
now? Can I hire someone else? Or so it's really the bigger picture. You have to zoom out here. We probably could get bogged down in the philosophy of it all and cognition and brain scans, but sometimes zooming out, as you said, Dahi, and looking at the whole picture can be important. But yeah, both is important, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess my that all makes sense, but I guess I'm trying to say, do we all have a responsibility? you know, a fellow once told me the way I think. He says, you want to take the blame off everybody. I said, I don't. I actually want to put it on everybody. Is it pretty much that, like, do we not all have a responsibility to this, rather than saying, let's fund the mental health services, let's fund them, and then it'll all be good.
Yeah.
I feel like there's something bigger, a societal shift, a shift in the way we think, in the way we
No,
help to
100%.
understand people. Yeah.
100%. And like, what I find really interesting, again, just kind of coming back to your point, which is crucial, and about, in terms of, say, the high rate of psychosis in immigrants, for example. And this again, lads, look, put straightforward here. I'm an academic researcher. That's what I'm trying to make my, you know, my very sort of narrow skill set to contribute something to society and to contribute something to help people. That's all I've ever wanted to do my whole life, was to help people, right? Genuinely. And, you know, this is the way I can find, this is my only way of doing it. I just want to tell you something really small and quick, but because listen, imagine first of all, like, being a mother who has decided to go back to do a PhD in philosophy in suburban Dublin. Can you imagine the looks? And I mean, like, my husband and his mother were the primary caregivers for 4 years while I went and I did this. And we flipped the script on its head. And I can tell you right now, we were pariahs, because people they couldn't get their heads around it. And why are you doing this? Like, what are you going to be, lady? You know what I mean?
Mm.
And it's like, oh, I'm sorry if I feel like I have a higher calling and I can't explain it to you because it's intuitive and it's something, and you know what I mean? Oh, anyway, the reason I say this is because, Conor is spot on in terms of talking about the practical, the very important practical side of how can we actually, fine, it's grand, we can come up with all these ideas, but how the hell do we get them to the people? Funding is absolutely key, or having proper, like, governmental or, societal economic support. I mean, Jesus, like, that's the only way ultimately we can make this a reality, okay? But another way, which is why I suppose I kind of love this work and chatting with you guys and getting out there as much as possible, is because, of course, it's old, but education, of course, is another huge factor that I believe has the power to change the world. Actually, that's why I teach philosophy for children, and I teach it mostly to primary school, and they would give you hope. In one session alone, you will feel hope to continue on living in the world. And my little story is, I remember I was in the middle of the PhD. Because my own, like, I was having, mania, very intense, like like, imagine someone who has undiagnosed ADHD going to do a PhD in philosophy. Like, all it did was make every single mental health issue I had come to light. And when the PhD finished, you can only imagine the fallout mentally from that. And I remember it was the week that the Ukraine war broke out. And I was in a shopping centre close by to my house. And I was already exasperated and just distressed over, what I was seeing. And I witnessed this horrible interaction between this older Irish gentleman and this lovely foreign national who was a Deliveroo guy. And he was there just to get McDonald's and do his job. And he had pulled in somewhere, and this Irish gentleman, it's not the right word to call him, this man anyway, he leapt out of his car and he held up the traffic to go up to your man and in his face start like roaring abuse at him. It was the most visceral encounter I've ever had with abject racism, actually, in this country. And where I live, it's calm, like, you wouldn't really be exposed to that much. And honest to God, like, when you're saying about what can we do to help and things, and sorry, I know I'm going a bit off topic, but kind of, like, I was terrified because your man was really intimidating the older guy, and he was roaring red, and he was effing and blinding and every derogatory name under the sun. And as soon as he went off, I actually ran over to your man, and he was like, "Who's this?" And I gave him a big hug, and I was crying, and I said, "Listen, that's disgusting, and I am so sorry. But we're like, that's the minority. We love you guys." Like, whatever, I can't even remember. And I rang my supervisor, and I was bawling, crying. And I was like, "Danielle, like, what are we doing? Why are we even doing this? Like, why are we doing this research? Why, blah, blah, blah." And in her calm, like, consummate professional response, she goes, "Laura Jane, we're educating people to change the world. We're educators. And the only way to affect change that's sustainable and that can, impact long term is education, And when she kind of put it that way, it gave me a purpose again. Do you know what I mean? To kind of move forward with this research and say, okay, of course, like, you have the incredible doctors and scientists and all these amazing people in the world, but they only have one very specific type of an education, And imagine if we could come up in an ideal world where we're all open to collaboration and communication and cooperation, and we're working together, and, you give me your insights and here are mine, and oh my God, let's come up with something, And I suppose, like, I'm just kind of saying all this, suffice to say that, like, where do I see all of this? How can you take all these theories and whatever? I firmly believe we can, because there's people who really want to affect change and who are willing to sort of lift their head above the parapet and go beyond and say, okay, we actually need something else here because it's not working right now, And I mean, it's like so incredible, Conor, to meet someone like yourself who is sort of trained in the scientific theoretical methods and way of thinking and so on. And, like, you've come up with this most beautiful concept, the art collective project that you do. I mean, that in and of itself is sort of a living example of sort of why I do what I do, why the group of guys I'm working with and I, for some reason, get on like a house on fire, because we all want the same thing. We all want to use what we can to bloody make a difference, So,
That was lovely. Thank you, Laura. That was lovely.
Sorry,
But,
I'm gonna cry now. We got very overstimulated. Sorry, go on.
It just brought something to mind with your art collective, Conor, and would this match up with the Porous self? Like, there's somebody with psychosis creates some art, puts that out into the world. Somebody else sees that art, gets a feeling from it, like, is that the transmission of self, or the porosity of self, kind of, is swimming around each other? Is this part of it?
A lot of the work of the Air Collective is hugely powerful. We've seen representations of people's experience, and sometimes not even being fully aware of the power that it can carry. So we've had poets like myself. We've visual artists, sculptures, musicians, singers, like basically everything. And if sometimes people just want to create art for the sake of it. You have a creative spark, and probably a lot of people would have been interested in creativity before they had their episode or before they became
Yeah.
unwell or spastic at all. So that was there anyways. And some people just like creating art. It's just fun. It's enjoyable. People share it, and that's great. But a lot of the time, then there is themes that come out that is related to mental
Yeah.
health, mental illness. And for me, I write poetry quite quickly. It's kind of like an automatic thing. Like I
Yeah.
do go back and edit them, but I do kind of
It's
scribble down the
affective.
words. It's a lot of my
Yeah.
poetry is very emotional, like
Yeah.
and it based off my own life, whatever. And
Beautiful.
it was actually when I started going to therapy, and sometimes I would bring in a poem, and I couldn't really make sense of it, and then we'd talk about the poem in therapy, and kind of try to elucidate something there. And that would actually some of the best sessions I had with a therapist was
Wow.
through doing that. So there is something there in art. I think we can communicate things that sometimes might otherwise go on unnoticed.
Mm.
And there is work being done. As I said, I'm presenting on the work of their collective at a conference. There is interest in this, arts and psychosis, arts and health is a big thing.
Yeah.
There's ways some people get into lived experience work, like myself. We get involved in research, we get involved in all sorts of things. But some people, no, that mightn't suit them. This creative outlet might be the only way that they can process what has happened to them. We did a piece of work uh, with the university. Um, we co-produced a animation which represented a psychotic episode.
Oh,
And
wow.
so it was stop motion. I'm sure you know what stop motion is. You
Yeah. Yeah.
move a little figure, and then you stop the camera or whatever like that, and then it comes through like a video. I'm probably laboring that point. I think everyone probably knows what that is. But you could hear a pin drop in that room when that was played. It's probably about
Wow.
5-6 minutes, and there was some dialogue, but mostly it was visual representations of there was music, there was sounds, there was different voices and different images. And even something similar we seen at an exhibition before me. You actually came, Dahi, to the exhibition. There was a similar video done where someone had taken pieces of video from during their episode, footage of their episode, and then
Really?
edited
Oh,
that into a kind
wow.
of representation of psychosis. But there's something going on there where I think personally, now there's probably not a huge amount of evidence on this, and I've written about this in some of my promotional content for the collective and TikTok, whatever like that. Um, that the art that the people create has a big effect on them. It helps shift something inside themselves, it stirs something. I can relate to that, as I said, with the therapy and all that. But when you put that out into the world, it can have a huge effect on other people. So we've done a bit of media work. I've been around, as they say. I've been done in the paper with the Arts Collective and a few different pieces, and people will message or they'll email the collective email and be like, I didn't realize this was the thing. I create art. I didn't realize there was something going on like this. So it does have power beyond just the self as well, and obviously it relates to how other people perceive a mental illness. And I think it brings a certain amount of hope and empowerment as well.
Mm.
That there is that element to it as well, where maybe a lot of people are creative, as I said before. They become unwell, and probably for a couple of weeks at least, or months, or maybe even years,
Yeah.
they don't return to that art craft or whatever they do, poetry, art. And then some people will message me and they'll say, I'm only getting back into art now after being unwell for a number of
Oh,
years. And it
yeah.
gives it hope, it gives empowerment, and it gives something to do. creatively, practically. We have Zoom calls, we chat. We chat about psychosis, obviously, our experiences, shared experiences. We chat about art, we chat about everything. But there's something in that collective. I think it's probably one of the favorite pieces of work that I've done. I've done a lot of research and, worked different jobs, as I said, recovery, education. But there's a little bit of a spark in, in the collective. And I don't want to be too self kind of promote myself too much, but I think there is something going on. There's been a lot of interest in it from different organizations for collaboration. So yeah, you're right. I think there's something going on there.
I think
Can I just say, I have a quote I have to read you both. And the minute I heard about your art collective, I went and I pulled it out because I think you'll really appreciate this. So there's a philosopher called Maurice Merleau-Ponty, okay? French guy, Phenomenology, 20th century. He was the only post-Husserlian philosopher to get him right. He's a fabulous thinker, right? And he is all about embodiment, okay? And in his book, The Phenomenology of Perception, remember, like, when we were talking and Dahi was asking about like the living body and like, does that kind of resonate? Well, he has this quote. It's one of my favorites, and it ties in nicely with your art collective concept. So he uses, when we talk about, remember I was saying about like everything, all the dimensions of us kind of ebbing and flowing, and everything is kind of inextricably linked, and it's dynamic, and it's this kind of porous, open, permeable exchange kind of always going on, right? The river, beautiful example, okay? And the way I've kind of mentioned this idea of like, there's this double-sided nature of all our lived experience, of all embodied lived experience. So you have sameness and difference. You have, uniqueness and commonality, individuality, social. There's always this kind of double-sidedness to everything that we experience, right? And in particular, do you remember you were asking earlier, Conor, you mentioned like, well, but we're kind of always changing, but we're the same, but it's all, this idea of sameness and difference of kind of thing. And the self and the porosity of the self gives this idea of self-identity and personal identity, okay? And effectively, it's just a way to conceptualize the kind of abiding sense of sameness that we have, that endures throughout all the change that we go through all the time. It's kind of trying to conceptualize how we can be same and different at the same time. And the unifying medium of the living body is how we can express this, okay? And Merleau-Ponty gives the following example to sort of explain this a little more, and I think you'll appreciate it. And he says, so he uses an example of a work of art to convey the continuous flow of synthesis and unity intrinsic to the ambiguous sense of persistence and change in the double-sided nature of embodied lived experience. He says that, quote, "The body cannot be compared to a physical object, but rather to a work of art, a novel, a poem, a painting, and a piece of music are beings in which the expression cannot be distinguished from the expressed, who sent forth their signification without ever leaving their temporal and spatial place. It is a knot of living significations."
nice.
Powerful. Yeah.
End quote.
I think that's a good thing to close it out on, guys. It really is. One quick question. I've asked you this before, Conor, I think, but I'll ask Laura as well. If we were to rewrite the story of what it is to be human, and you could put in one sentence, what would it be?
Oh my God.
Rewrite the story
Dahi.
of what it means to be human. Is that
Of what it is to be human.
is
Let's say we
yeah.
were wiping the slate and leaving a note for the next iteration of humanity, and you could put in one sentence.
Okay.
I'll let you go
Well,
first, Laura.
Can I? Thanks, Conor. So nice of you. Yeah. Well, look, mine are going to sound really cliche, but I will tell you now, it's how I live my life and it's how I raise my children. Because, we're a spiritual family. We're not religious per se. We don't follow like organized religion, but I teach love and compassion and kindness, humility, honesty. These for me are the core aspects of being a human being. And, you know, I suppose I would say, like, kindness, understanding, communication, and love are the cornerstone of being a human being, to be honest.
That will do.
That's like does that make, like, is that
That
okay?
that will do. That will do. Conor, have you anything to add?
Yeah, and like I'll give a little bit of a preamble as well. Like obviously, and we've talked a lot about our work and being human in our work and how like what motivates us and why we do things. Like obviously, I do my work because I've had experience, Laura, something similar.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I think in that and general, like this could apply to any profession. I'll sum it up in a simple way. Leave the world a little bit better off than how you came into it. I think if we can
Oh,
all have that effect and have
yeah.
an imprint on society in some small way,
Lovely.
that help.
Lovely. I hope the listeners take that on. I hope I take it on too, because we can't all be good all the time. Let's be honest.
No, but we can try.
We can try, and we can wake
Try
up the
and
next
try
day. We can
again.
wake up the next day and try again if it doesn't go well. But okay, Laura, Conor, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for all the wisdom you've both dropped here. And listeners, thanks for listening.
Thanks so
Bye-bye
much,
now.
guys.